We're going to go ahead and get started, if that's all right. Actually start on time, which is nice around this place. That doesn't always happen, but this is a very important day, and I just want to welcome you all. My name is Randy Hultgren. I'm a congressman from the 14th Congressional District in Illinois. It is the 7 counties that wrap around Cook County in Illinois, so just west of Chicago and north of Chicago. But really honored to have you all here, especially honored to have an incredible group of panelists, experts who are going to be talking about very, very important subject. There's really nothing more important, I believe, that we could be talking about, and something that I'm more convinced every single day that we can do something about this. We can stop this. You can't not know about this or know about it and not do something. And so that is really my hope, is for us just to continue to spread the word, to understand the seriousness of what is happening clearly around the world, but also in our own backyards, and that we are responsible if we don't do something, if we know about this. So welcome. As many of you know, we were supposed to have this hearing about a little over a month ago, and there was this little thing called Snowmageddon here in Washington, D.C. Chicago, the snow is a challenge for us, as we know, but we kind of deal with it. You know, you get 5, 6, 7 inches, we get through it. D.C., 1 or 2 inches, it becomes paralyzing. 32 inches, forget it. It's shut down. And so I apologize that we had to change things. Sometimes things just happen, and you have to roll with that. And that's what we did. But I'm so grateful for our panelists who are here. Some who are going to be here, some who now are filling in for those who were going to be here who can't be at this date. But anyhow, I think we've got an amazing group of people here today. So I also want to thank a couple people who have been very influential in my life, mentors to me in some ways, and I want to thank the co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Congressman Joe Pitts, and also Congressman Jim McGovern, have shown consistently strong leadership and have raised their voices through this commission on behalf of those around the world who are deprived of their basic human rights. Again, something so important for us to be working together and fighting together on. Also want to thank Exodus Cry. So grateful for everyone at Exodus Cry, their incredible help that they've provided to me, but also Shared Hope International for their valuable work in fighting human trafficking and restoring survivors, and for their assistance with today's briefing. I also especially want to thank our distinguished panelists here today, from whom you will hear shortly. Some of them themselves are survivors of human trafficking and now advocate for those still entrapped in this sinister and nefarious global enterprise. All are on the front lines fighting on behalf of victims and against those who seek to steal the souls of society's most vulnerable, especially purchasers of commercial sex who stoke the demand for sex trafficking. Demand for commercial sex that fuels the global sex trade, resulting in human trafficking becoming a major human rights crisis, is the central theme of today's briefing. Increasing evidence reveals that demand plays a critical role in sustaining sex trafficking. It's one of those things, if men stopped purchasing sex overnight, the demand for sex trafficking would stop. It remains an industry run largely by and for the benefit and profit of men. Men overwhelmingly tend to be the buyers of commercial sex. And as I said, we could end this overnight if all men stopped buying sex. Human trafficking at its base, then, is an economic, albeit insidious, enterprise. It is fundamentally an issue of supply and demand, as sick as that sounds. Earlier this Congress, I introduced H.R. 611, the Sex Trafficking Demand Reduction Act. This legislation acknowledges the significance of the demand factor inherent in human trafficking. It requires nations to recognize demand and to account for their actions to reduce demand in their efforts to fight sex trafficking. Their commitment to address demand, these countries' commitment to address demand, will be factored into a country's tier ranking in the State Department's annual Trafficking in Persons report. Sex trafficking flourishes where demand exists for commercial sex and an environment of impunity for its customers. Therefore, eliminating demand is a major step towards eliminating human trafficking as a global human rights crisis. Today, we will hear from frontline experts in the fight against human trafficking as they discuss its dangers and the damages caused by purchasers of commercial sex. We will also hear about the successful efforts employed to combat demand It's my hope that through today's briefing, we will come away with a better understanding of how demand for commercial sex drives the human trafficking industry, and a greater resolve to stand with those who fight for the basic human rights of those who are violated and exploited. With that, I want to introduce our first presenter. And what I'll do is I'll introduce each presenter and then give them a chance to speak. And then when they're finished with their presentation, I'll introduce the next speaker. But let me at least go through and introduce them. So if they can just wave first. Tiana Bien-Aimé. I'm sorry, I probably didn't do very well with that. By the end of the day, I'll do better. Tiana Bien-Aimé is Executive Director, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. She's going to be our first presenter. Second, Ernie Allen Global Consulting. Third, Tina Front, Founder and Executive Director of Courtney's House. Fourth, Marion Hatcher, the Cook County Sheriff's Office of Illinois. Fifth will be Georgia Attorney General Samuel Owens. And then finally, last but not least, Kubiki Pride, mother of a survivor. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to first turn it over to Tiana Bien-Aimé. Wow, let me try it again. Tiana Bien-Aimé, Executive Director, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Congressman. So my name is Tiana Bien-Aimé, for anybody who took a little bit of French in high school. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which I head, is an international organization that works to end all forms of human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of women and girls around the world. And we work in the United States and on every continent. And we look at commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking as gender-based violence and discrimination. I just wanted to thank the Congressman and the Commission, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, for this extraordinary opportunity to talk about this really urgent human rights crisis. Under the leadership of the great Eleanor Roosevelt, governments gathered after World War II to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which lays out the basic principles of our inalienable and indivisible rights, among which that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of persons. Specific to human trafficking, the Declaration establishes that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude, and slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. No organization or official entity, from the United Nations to the United States State Department, truly knows how many people are trafficked around the world for both labor and sexual purposes. The numbers range from 4 million to 27 million, depending on the sources. However, there is overwhelming agreement on at least 2 points. First, that 79 to 80% of trafficked persons are women and children, and that the majority of the population is trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation. Secondly, we know and understand that the economic equations of supply and demand are applicable to this multi-billion-dollar illegal market. Human trafficking is not only a pervasive crime that is hidden in plain sight, but it is an extraordinarily lucrative one, perpetrated with very low risk of punishment for the trafficker. The International Labor Organization estimates illegal profits from human trafficking at $150 billion, $90 billion of which emanating from sex trafficking. Labor trafficking thrives on the demand for cheap goods and free labor, and as it relates to sex trafficking, it is the demand for prostitution that fuels it. The work of my colleagues at this table and beyond remain at the heart and core of the path in finding solutions to end human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. I have the great privilege and honor to work alongside survivor leaders, like my two colleagues here, and frontline direct service providers who inform us in identifying the best solutions to ending these crimes. We work with legislators and policymakers to ensure that national laws continue making the links between sex trafficking and the sex trade, including prostitution, the link between sex trafficking and the demand for prostitution, and the link between violence against women and exploitation in the sex trade. We need laws like the Sex Trafficking Demand Reduction Act that will both strengthen our trafficking laws and mandate a clear focus on targeting the demand that nourishes the thriving multi-billion-dollar worldwide sex trade. Article 9 of the Palermo Protocol, the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish the trafficking of persons, especially women and children, which the United States ratified in 2005, urges governments to adopt or strengthen legislative or other measures to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and children, that leads to trafficking. Last year, a number of governments did just that when Ireland, Northern Ireland, Croatia, Canada, Israel, Lithuania, and France followed the examples of Sweden, Norway, and Iceland by enacting or proposing laws that address the demand for commercial sex acts, addressing exploitation in the sex trade as gender-based violence and discrimination, and punishing those who purchase human beings for sexual acts. This legal framework is known as the Nordic model, or increasingly, the equality model based on human rights principles. Independent reports from the governments of Sweden and Norway have shown that targeting the demand for prostitution has reduced the level of street prostitution and sex trafficking, exponentially so compared to their neighboring countries that have not adopted such laws. In addition, in 2014, the European Parliament passed a resolution on sexual exploitation and prostitution and its impact on gender equality, calling on member states to achieve through legislation the shift of, and I quote, the criminal burden unto those who purchase sexual services rather than those who sell it, thus reducing demand, end quote. It is equally time for the United States to continue fulfilling our commitment to ending sex trafficking by focusing on demand. H.R. 611, introduced by Representative Randy Hultgren, would accelerate these efforts. As a society, we have great difficulty in examining commercial sexual exploitation and prostitution as forms of violence, power, of control over persons with acute vulnerabilities such as childhood sexual violence, homelessness, racial inequalities. The concept is even difficult for human rights organizations, our colleagues, such as Amnesty International, who is proposing to call on governments to decriminalize pimps, brothel owners, and buyers of sexual acts as a means to protect the exploited. This is a travesty of human rights. We must instead stand with the women and girls, men and boys who are bought and sold in the sex trade, and not with the exploiters who profit or benefit from their suffering. On a personal note, the name I bear, Taina, is of a native Caribbean tribe, the Tainos, whose language has no word for prostitution. This is a conversation I've had with many Indigenous and First Nations women who work to end the sex trade, who they too cannot find the word or concept of prostitution in their foremothers' language. Generations of lives and communities have been destroyed and desecrated by sexual exploitation and sexual trafficking. Prostitution was never inevitable. It was invented, and therefore we can dismantle it. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon recently said, "Society is as strong as its weakest member. Combating human trafficking requires an intensive collaborative network among anti-trafficking organizations, working with law enforcement, government, civil society, labor unions, men and boys, faith-based groups, and youth groups. We must also forge alliances with the medical community, including mental health providers, who can provide us with concrete data on the harms of prostitution exacted by buyers of sexual acts and pimps. Finally, and most importantly, we must invest in the growing movement of survivors who are guiding us toward changing our cultural belief that lulls us to believe that prostitution is a so-called victimless crime. Instead, it is time to move forward toward the understanding that commercial sex acts are crimes perpetrated by buyers, the people with power and money, over people who have neither, and therefore consent, agency, and empowerment are at best illusory and at worst non-existent. Where do human rights begin? Eleanor Roosevelt asked. In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. And so this is where our task begins, to end human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation and to support the Sex Trafficking Demand Reduction Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I took Swedish and Spanish.
It's okay.
And I didn't do very well in either of those either. But Tiana, thank you. And I blew it. I didn't read your bio that I want to read because you've just done some amazing things. And so I apologize for that. So let me read that quickly, and then we'll go on to the next presenter. But Ms. Bien-Aimé, her expertise in human trafficking began over 2 decades ago when she joined the board of the international human rights organization Equality Now. Subsequently served as its executive director from 2001 until 2011. She led and participated in national and international coalitions that successfully advocated for strong anti-trafficking legislation, from international conventions to the U.S. Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act to New York State's groundbreaking Human Trafficking Act of 2007. Also under her tenure, Equality Now initiated the first campaigns against sex tourism and formed the Fund for Grassroots Activism to End Sex Trafficking, supporting community-based groups in 12 countries on 5 continents that provide direct services to victims and push their governments to address trafficking in women and girls. Thank you again for your great work, and thank you so much for your testimony today and your words. We really do appreciate it. Next, want to introduce our second witness, Ernie Allen of Allen Global Consulting. Ernie Allen is a global expert on child abduction, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and the dark web. He speaks to global audiences on these issues and advises governments, law enforcement, technology companies, and nonprofit organizations. He currently chairs a global initiative to combat online exploitation for UK Prime Minister David Cameron. He serves on several corporate boards and is an advisor to the Ethisphere Institute in the U.S., Il Telefono Azzurro in Italy, ECPAT, ECPAT International in Thailand, and others. He is a founding board member of the End Modern Slavery Initiative Foundation and serves as an advisor on human trafficking to the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Allen was named a pathbreaker for his victim-centered anti-trafficking efforts by Shared Hope International in 2013. Previously, he was architect, first chairman, and president and CEO of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. He also created the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children and served simultaneously as its president and CEO. We're very honored today to have Mr. Ernie Allen, and I yield to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Hultgren and General Olens. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be in a room with a lot of friends with whom I've worked for a lot of years. And I'm particularly pleased to be here at the request of my friends and allies at Shared Hope, Eliza and Samantha, and my great friend, Congresswoman Linda Smith. For many years, we have emphasized the importance of attacking demand. And this is not just a U.S. issue. And Congressman, I'm particularly enthusiastic and want to echo Taina's endorsement of your Sex Trafficking Demand Reduction Act. I think it's timely. It sends a message both in the United States and globally. And I want to point out that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Sale of Children, Child Prostitution, and Child Pornography is releasing her report next week. And in it, she concludes, and she calls upon all stakeholders to focus on the demand factor and establish comprehensive strategies to reduce it effectively. My belief is that in the United States, we need to do no less. We've made enormous progress, but let me take you back 13 years. Congressman Hultgren reminded you that for almost 30 years I ran the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And in 2003, I was honored to play a part in designing and implementing a new approach addressing sex trafficking in this country. It was called Innocence Lost, and it was developed in partnership with the FBI and the United States Department of Justice. And the philosophy was very basic. Historically, when law enforcement addressed the problem of trafficking in this country, they did it almost exclusively at the local level and almost entirely by the arrest of the victim. So the goal of Innocence Lost was to look at this problem from the 30,000-foot level and in a multi-jurisdictional collaborative way. So we created task forces around the country, federal, state, local task forces working together. And the results have been dramatic. The most recent data I've seen, which are about a year old, indicate that more than 1,600 traffickers have been successfully prosecuted. And those prosecutions have led to unprecedented sentences, more than a dozen life sentences for these traffickers, multiple sentences of 20 years and up. So you would expect, with that kind of collaborative, coordinated effort over the span of 13 years, that the problem would have disappeared, or at least declined dramatically. The very opposite happened. Almost as soon as the trafficker goes away, somebody else springs up in his place. How is that possible? Well, what we have learned is that there's a very basic equation here. This is behavior that is easy to do, very little risk, addressing a problem with enormous consumer demand, and therefore is enormously profitable. So the decision that is being made in communities across this country and around the world is that the balance between risk and reward is not yet onerous enough that it is encouraging people not to engage in these behaviors. Now, why? Let me suggest 4 simple reasons. One is, while enormous progress has been made, particularly since the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, while enormous progress has been made, still much of America believes this is a problem that exists, but it only exists somewhere else on the other side of the world. Or they believe that if it happens in the United States, it only happens in our largest cities, and that the victims are exclusively foreign nationals who are trafficked into this country for this purpose. What we have learned, what I've learned in the past 13 years, is that overwhelmingly the victims are American citizens, many of them American kids, most of them who leave home initially voluntarily, and are then targeted on the streets with kindness, friendship, even love, and find that they are in a situation that they can't walk away from. Second factor in all of this is most Americans think this problem is about sex. It's not. It's about slavery. There are real victims. This is 21st century slavery. The juvenile victims are primarily runaways, throwaways, kids targeted out of the child welfare system, homeless kids. These are forgotten victims that the world doesn't recognize. Third issue, most Americans still believe this is a street crime problem. This only happens in the, quote, bad areas of town where good people don't go. What we've learned in the past 13 years is that this problem has migrated. It has moved largely from the streets to the internet. Today, those who seek to access kids or adults for sex can shop from the privacy of their own homes or hotel rooms. And the risk for the trafficker is far less than it's ever been. There have been aggressive efforts to eliminate the marketing and sale of kids for sex via internet sites, and you'll hear from Marion a compelling example of those efforts. But the practice continues and is growing worldwide. And my fourth factor, and I believe the most important one, is that the customers who patronize this illicit industry, who create the demand for the sale of kids and adults for sex, and thus who are responsible for sustaining it, do not match society's stereotype. And overwhelmingly, they are not treated like the criminals they really are. Surely, those who would purchase a child for sex looks and acts like a criminal or a deviant. Well, not exactly. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're businessmen, they're school teachers, they're coaches, they're even police officers. They have wives and children at home. They don't look evil, and they're viewed by the public as model citizens. Yet if we're ever going to have impact on this problem, we have to create real deterrence. We have to hold them accountable for their behaviors and make them think twice before they engage in that behavior. The behavior is criminal, yet the courts and prosecutors in this country are overwhelmingly reluctant to charge or prosecute them, and we need to change that. And despite the growing numbers of prosecutions of traffickers, it's clear that arrest and prosecution of traffickers alone will not solve this problem. And the reason is there is massive consumer demand, and it has never been more blatant nor more normalized than in this era of the internet. Many websites that sell human beings for sex are protected by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, passed by Congress in 1996. These sites receive civil immunity under the CDA and may only be prosecuted by federal authorities, not state authorities. Prostitution is a crime in all 50 states. Yet the responsibility for investigating and prosecuting this crime resides solely with state authorities. Absent interstate transportation or some other factor, the federal government has no role in prosecuting prostitution in this country. And yet, states are barred from investigating and prosecuting prostitution in this country where it involves an internet site. In July 2013, I worked with 47 state attorneys general, including General Olens of Georgia, who drafted and sent a letter to Congress urging a narrow, surgical, two-word amendment to the CDA, giving states the authority to investigate these internet sites under state law. It was a bipartisan exercise. And General Olens may know better, but I dare you to find 47 state elected officials who would agree on anything. And these 47 AGs all signed the letter asking Congress to act. Last year, Congress passed, and Congressman Hultgren co-sponsored the SAVE Act, the Stop Advertising Victims of Exploitation Act. I'm grateful and admire Congressman Hultgren's leadership on that, but I think there's more work to do. I believe that Congress must still address the central problem, which is Section 230 of the CDA. It must at least give state and local authorities the ability to investigate internet sites for violations of offenses that are exclusively state crimes. The population we're most concerned about, juveniles and adults, are not engaging in these activities willingly and voluntarily. They are 21st century slaves who do not receive the proceeds of their labors and lack the ability to walk away. They're also brutalized and traumatized by those who traffic and control them. So my suggestion to you is that this is not what Congress intended in 1996. And this is a problem that Congress needs to fix. In the United States and around the world, traffickers sell human beings because it's easy, low risk, with huge consumer demand, and is thus enormously profitable. We need to follow the money, attack the demand, increase the risk, and eliminate the profitability. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Wow, very well said. Thank you so much. Definitely do want to follow up on that too. We'll open it up to questions after everybody's statement too. So if you have questions, please think of those. But wondered if there is legislation right now to clear that up, following up on the letter from the 47 states. I haven't seen anything specific to that, but would be very interested in helping with that. Just see if we could draft something and push that forward. So
that'd be great.
Let's
Thank
follow
you.
up after the time we're together today. Well, thank you so much for your work and for your statement, Mr. Allen. Next, very honored to be able to introduce Tina Front, founder and executive director of Courtney's House. Tina Front founded Courtney's House in 2008 in order to provide services to survivors of sex trafficking ages 12 to 21 in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Since its inception, Courtney's House has helped over 500 survivors recover from their trafficking experience. Ms. Front and Courtney's House also train law enforcement and other nonprofit groups to recover and provide resources to survivors. They also work with any group that may come in contact with trafficking, church groups, foster parents, social workers, teachers, hotel employees, etc., to raise awareness about identifying survivors and properly reporting to authorities. As a survivor of domestic sex trafficking, Tina has become a high-profile national advocate on the issue. She has been featured on numerous national television shows and publications, including the OWN Network's Our America with Lisa Ling, 3 a.m. Girls, which featured an undercover look into sex trafficking in Washington, D.C., as well as the CNN Freedom Project and Red Book magazine. Thank you, Tina, for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm going to add one thing. I was newly appointed to the White House Advisory Board on Human Trafficking, and just want to mention that because that's really important that now we actually have a White House Advisory Board of survivors of foreign national, U.S. domestic servitude, sex trafficking, labor that's actually going to be working on policy and what policies are important to push in the future. So it is great to be here and around so many people that are from where I am originally from, Chicago, Illinois. So Courtney's house is based here in D.C., and we work with boys and girls who were trafficked. We are a drop-in center, ages 11 to 21. So I said both male and female, and we work on long-term programs and doing street outreach. So I know we hear a lot about the internet, and there's probably not that much going on the street. However, we do street outreach, and our street outreach is conducted about 4.5 blocks away from the White House. So this area is a high trafficking area. So I'm going to need you to sit back, close your eyes, and think about why this area would be a high trafficking area. And then let's talk about demand. With that being said, I'm going to talk about questions that most people ask me about the demand that I get asked every single day. Probably questions that all of you are having right now. One of those is, do the men who buy sex, do they really know that this person may be being controlled? How much is their knowledge on that? I think it's actually interesting that we ask that question, but we'll talk about later as a society why we even ask that question. So let's go back to really understand, because I think that's a good question to ask. My trafficking situation started at 9 years old inside the foster care in Chicago, Illinois. So when people ask me that, I think back in my own situation and say, I don't know, did someone know I was 9? Did they fully know that? Did they make that decision to know? But do we feel bad as a society for me when I was 9? Would you feel bad when I was 13 and I got no help? Would you feel sorry for me at 16? Would you blame me and not the man who bought sex at 18? Is it then now my fault and we take all the blame from them? See, as a society, we created a name. And the name that we created for men who buy sex is the word John. See, we normalized it from the very beginning. And when we created this word John as a name of a person who buys sex, right then and there we said the people who are being abused isn't important. We said this man, we'll call him John because we don't want to know his real name. He has a family. He has a job that we don't want him to lose, so we'll normalize this. And we'll say that the man who buys sex, we'll call him John. The thing about that is that I know some good men who are called John, you know, John the Baptist and many others. But women and girls and children who are forced in it, we'll call them a prostitute. And we'll say it's their fault, no matter if they're 12 or 11 or 10. But these men, let's protect their name and make sure they keep their job so they can keep the traffickers in business. So when I think about the demand, I've always thought it was an issue. I actually didn't understand as a survivor why other people didn't understand it. So let's go through some of those questions again, and maybe we'll talk about the other bigger pieces of why our society really created the situation that we're in. So let's go to the next question. Usually, people then ask me, but isn't it different for boys? You say that you work with boys. But boys, it's survival sex. It's survival sex because some of the boys identify as gay and transgender and they need a place to stay, something to eat. So we created this word survival sex. Now let's talk about that word survival sex that we created as a society again. See, it would be survival sex if another 14-year-old boy was buying sex. Okay. with another 14-year-old boy to survive these hard streets. The problem is this grown men buying sex from kids to survive or a place to eat. But we said that's okay for a man to buy sex from a child because a child needs a place to eat. I want you to think about that statement for a moment. And if that didn't make sense to you out loud, then that is the society that we created. We created that. So we created another word so that we don't pay attention to child sexual abuse. So when kids come to us, and we do support groups at Courtney's house, and they're called Transitioning Your Mindset Out of the Life, because there are myths that we have to learn. So because of my own experience and all of our survivors, I thought that it was okay for men to buy sex. I thought as a child I was wrong because I got in trouble, I got arrested. But I thought it was fine. Now, many moons ago when I was younger. But the sadder part is just last week at support group, all my kids think the same thing. And the reason why they think the same thing is, guess what? We created that as a society. That they don't understand what child sexual abuse is, because I didn't either. So you can't understand it when someone always took it from you. If I was 9 years old and 90% of all of our survivors, including myself, are sexually abused before their sex trafficking situation, it means I never had consensual sex. It means that I do not know that my body is a temple. It means that when men approach me and say, come on, let's do it, do this, here, what, I'm going to, because I don't understand how to say no, but they know how to ask. So when we think about the demand and how important it is, are we actually really thinking about the different layers? So let me take you out of that for a second. I am in middle schools and high schools inside the area and outside the area. So in a very nice area in Maryland, because immediately when we think of trafficking, we think of those other poorer side, but 44% of all my referrals come from parents who actively are in their children's life, because again, we took the blame off, right? And we blamed it once again on the child, on the parent, on everybody, but not the man who bought sex and not the trafficker. We blamed everybody else again, which takes us back to being in school. So I'm with sixth graders in a health education class. And we talk about a curriculum on trafficking. We do it very differently. One of the things I ask the kids first is everyone in the room, again, I am talking to 11 and 12-year-olds. So I always say, okay, let me ask everybody a question. Is it okay to sell yourself for sex if you're 16? Everyone raises their hand, every kid. Teachers, you know, she's having a convention fit over here, passing out. Everyone raises their hand. And then I say, okay, what about 14? Everybody raises their hand. I say 13, everybody raises their hand. I have 11 and 12-year-olds, sixth grade. I say, okay, 10, it's a split. 9 is still a split. So then I say, well, is that bad? Because isn't that a grown man touching you and giving you money to perform stuff? Is that abuse? They say no, because they gave you money for it. So now we say, oh my goodness, we need to educate these kids. And I say, oh my goodness, they learned it from us. They learned it from us. So one of the things we actually work on the most is what sexual abuse is. That this isn't okay, the man is not supposed to do this. The next question I asked actually made the teacher get up to get the principal. And that question was, how many of you on your way to school, on your way home, both boys and girls, just with your friends, how many times do cars stop and ask you for a ride? Everybody hand raised up and said, before anyone never talked about this. So the first thing they said was, oh my God, it happens all the time. And the teacher said, oh my God, I need a principal. But this happens at every school I go to. And that was middle school. So when we're thinking about the demand, let's go back there. So you think these men are not buying sex online and on the street? That they just happen to be driving a middle school and for the first time ever, they've decided to pull over and ask you for a ride just because today is the day? Or is this some behavior that they've been doing for years and don't get caught with, so they feel privileged? So they feel that I can do it. See, when somebody buys you, it isn't about sex. But exactly what Ernie said is actually very true. Because you all think about the sex. Do you think about the other big issue I have to talk to the kids about? See, when someone purchases you, they own you. For 2 minutes, 5 minutes, an hour a day, I can call you anything I want to call you out your name. I could treat you any way I want to treat you out your name. I have, all of us, I'm pretty sure, have jumped out of a window, have jumped out of 80-mile-per-hour cars so you don't get killed and raped. So do the man that buys sex? No. Maybe it should be asked a different question. Do the men that buy sex care? Because plenty of times they told me, don't tell me your age because you look like my granddaughter. Don't tell me your age because you look like my daughter. So for me growing up, I just knew they were probably doing the same exact thing they were doing to me, to their own family, but why are we sitting here telling other people and making you all believe that's true? You don't think they abuse their kids? They go out and buy sex and abuse them. Did we just separate a person who buys sex and a pedophile? Did we put them in different categories? Or does now it sounds the same? Because guess what? The mindset is the same with an abuser. Men who abuse children or women who abuse children, it is never their fault. It's never their fault. They never did anything wrong. It's always the child's fault. It's the same thing on the demand of men. But wait a minute. I'm going to throw a question. Are we talking about two different types of men, or are we talking about one and the same? Are we? So maybe, just maybe, there are more men than we think that feel privileged with power and money, that they can buy and use people the way they want. Because if kids are walking down the street in every city I've talked to, and they can tell me that, then no, we need to change our language. This should have been done a long time ago. It goes hand in hand together. Thank you so much for my time.
Thank you, Tina, so much. Next, I want to introduce Marion Hatcher. Marion is with the Cook County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Dart is a good friend of mine, and I'm so grateful that Marion is able to be here representing Sheriff Dart and the great work going on in the Cook County Sheriff's Office. Marion Hatcher has been with the Cook County Sheriff's Office for 12 years and serves as a senior project manager and human trafficking coordinator for the Office of Public Policy. She supports the coordination of several of the CCSO's anti-trafficking efforts, including the National John Suppression Initiative, a nationwide effort with more than 100 participating law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, targeting the buyers of sex as the driving force of sex trafficking and prostitution. Her office also has a long history of combating online facilitation of trafficking. As a national expert on combating the demand for commercial sex, she has testified before the Illinois and Colorado legislatures, has been featured on the OWN documentary Prostitution, Leaving the Life, the Inc. 180 documentary, the Shared Hopes Gang Trap series, for which she was also a consultant. She is a recipient of a number of awards, including the 2013 FBI Award for Outstanding Assistance with Investigative Efforts, the DePaul University Helen F. McGillicuddy Award for her work in the advancement of women and gender rights, and the Shared Hope Pathbreaker Award. Her article, 10 Years and Counting, was published in Police Chief magazine as a companion article to a piece written by Cook County Sheriff Thomas J. Dart, both focused on human trafficking. Marion, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Good morning, everyone. It is my privilege to represent the Sheriff of Cook County, Thomas J. Dart, and on his behalf, I've had the privilege of coordinating a number of law enforcement efforts that are related to prostitution. He saw the need to focus on the demand that fuels the brutal crime by arresting sex buyers, and conceived in 2011 a unique effort to highlight the role of sex solicitors as perpetrators to this violent and exploitive industry. The National John Suppression Initiative, previously called the National Day of John's Arrests, led by the Sheriff's Office, is a coalition that has grown from 8 jurisdictions with 216 buyer arrests in our pilot to 63 arresting agencies and over 100 partners, having executed 11 operations over a 5-year stretch. The collaborative effort has led to the arrest of more than 4,400 total sex buyers. In addition to that, the sheriff created a human trafficking response team, of which I am a coordinator and a team member. There are 3 of us that are survivors of the sex trade that work for him, excuse me. And we have also, while we do this demand-focused effort, we also have provided more than 600 interventions with women and girls since 2009, February 2009. Not only have we arrested 4,400 plus sex buyers, but we've rescued hundreds and hundreds of women and girls, and transgender and boys. We've also arrested scores of pimps and traffickers, as you might expect. We have also noticed, of course, that while we do these operations, these stings, that there are many associated crimes, as you might expect, and there are hundreds and hundreds and probably thousands of charges in my database that are related to narcotics and weapons and kidnapping and even murder. Sheriff Dart stated recently that sex trafficking continues to destroy countless lives, and this broad national movement should send a strong message to prospective Johns that their quote-unquote hobby is much more than a victimless crime. As a survivor of prostitution, I can say that it most certainly is not a victimless crime. And as a member of Space International Survivors of Prostitution calling for enlightenment, representing 7 countries, the United States, Germany, France, Denmark, Ireland, Canada, and the United Kingdom, it's our educated stance that the role most responsible for the exploitative practice of prostitution is the demand-inducing function of the buyer. Men who buy sexual access to the bodies of women and girls do not simply assist and support the sex trade, they are responsible for creating it. This is a demand-driven trade, no different in its operative components than any other commercial enterprise. The members of Space International know through our collective experience in our own lives and that of the women that we deliver services to, that the institution of prostitution owes its existence, its very existence, to those who demand that it exists. And that if our legislators deal strongly with that demand, as they are, as we see, under the law, we will not have to worry about the pimps and the traffickers, because our lawmakers will have put them out of business. The nature of abolition does not involve the reformation of prostitution in the present day any more than it involved the reformation of chattel slavery in days gone by. We are not seeking to support policies that divide trafficked from prostituted, and I'm very glad to see that this legislation connects the dots, the prostitution to trafficking, and we can't separate adult from child, as Tina so eloquently connected that. The 18th birthday doesn't change anything, except make them now a criminal. I mean, even many of our juveniles are still considered criminals in many states, even though they're safe harbor and there are laws that are supposed to prevent that. It's child abuse, pure and simple. But it's abuse, whether it's an adult or a person who's yet to reach the age of accountability. We seek to uphold the dignity of humanity, all humanity, in every way it manifests. As long as we endorse the erroneous notion of a person's physical dignity as more worthwhile than another's, we uphold the toxic principle of inferiority itself. All we seek is the impartial delegation of freedom with inherent rights and protections from men who choose to abuse, forever abolishing value assignation to that which is beyond measure. We are God's handiwork, priceless works of art sculpted in greatness and meant from birth to be treated with the gravest courtesy. Let us take a pause, and respectfully, I'm taking poetic license, echoing elements of the veiled vision of the late Dr. Martin Luther King in his historic final speech, in which he assured humanity that we as a people would get to the promised land. If we replace the sanitation worker to which he so eloquently referenced in his speech, the prostituted person, they too will get to the promised land if we redistribute the pain of the victim and place it instead on the buyer causing harm. And by biblical example of the Good Samaritan in the same historic speech that night, do not ask if I stop to help this woman or girl in need, what will happen to me, but instead ask, if I do not stop to help the woman or girl, what will happen to them? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion, so much. Next, grateful to have Georgia Attorney General Samuel S. Olens with us. The Honorable Sam Olens was sworn in as Georgia's 53rd Attorney General on January 10th, 2011. That year, he worked with legislators to strengthen the penalties for sex trafficking, making Georgia's law one of the toughest in the nation. 2012, he spearheaded the first comprehensive revision of Georgia's sunshine laws in more than a decade. In 2013, he led the effort to stem the epidemic of prescription drug abuse with a law that requires pain management clinics to be licensed and regulated. Olens currently is chair of the Southern Region of the National Association of Attorney General and co-chairs the Federalism Preemption Committee. General Olens, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Congressman, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel and to be at this hearing of the Tom Santos Human Rights Commission. Prior to serving as Attorney General for Georgia, I was a county executive, a county chair, and at that time I was active in a child abuse center in my county. So I learned a lot about child abuse, sex abuse at that time, but had no idea, about sex trafficking. Shortly after my election, we had a meeting in Florida, the National Association of Attorneys General, and former Congressman Linda Smith was one of the speakers. And at that time, she provided a bunch of information from Shared Hope. And I think a bunch of us in the room were just sort of aghast at the data. On the one hand, we could feel good that as bad as our state's laws were, we were in great company with many other states that had pathetic laws. But I came back from that conference saying we were going to do something about it. So as you noted, Congressman, in 2011, we made a huge difference in our state working with a couple leaders in the legislature in this area. I don't use terms like pimp and John. I use trafficker because under our statutory construct, both the buyers and sellers are traffickers with the same potential penalties. And I think that's one of the first things that needs to occur. And we have emphasized throughout demand. We've emphasized throughout that you can't solve the problem without dealing with the buyers. The sellers are going to be there as long as there's willing buyers, as everyone has said before me. So this is all about the buyers. So now if you're convicted of sex trafficking that includes coercing or deceiving minor victims under the age of 18, you can get life in prison. It's 25 to 50 or life. And Kamala Wright, who's with me today, who's our full-time statewide sex trafficking prosecutor, has on numerous occasions gotten life, along with another prosecutor in DeKalb County. Kamala was previously in Fulton. I stole her so she could have statewide jurisdiction at that time. So we are constantly trying to improve our laws as well as other sex-related laws. So for instance, in our state, pandering carries a term of 5 to 20 years if the victim is 16 or 17, and 10 to 30 years if the child is under 16. Additionally, one good thing about the Georgia law, in contrast to federal law, is that the buyer takes his victim as she comes. In other words, you can't say she looked 18. If she is under 18, that's trafficking with the greater penalty. Under the federal law, you have to show reasonable opportunity to observe. In Georgia, it's the straight age. That's all there is, and that's all there should be. The buyer should not be able to say, I thought she was 18. It's got to be the buyer's risk in that process. We also last year passed forfeiture provisions, as well as having a constitutional amendment on the ballot this November where anyone involved in the adult entertainment business, which would by definition include minors if they were in the adult entertainment side, would pay a hefty fine, and we expect that to pass this November, and I expect to be sued the day after the results are certified. And that's what makes life busy in the AG's office. So what we do around the state, both Kamala and myself in partnership with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and several other nonprofits, is we go all over the state educating. And we educate anyone and everyone. If you would have told me how many churches I go into to talk about sex trafficking, I never would have believed it. But we do full-day programs with school counselors because they have to know what the signs are vis-a-vis the children in their schools. They need to know the signs of a victim of sex trafficking. We talk to the prosecutors. We are planning a program this fall teaching judges, law enforcement of any shape and size. We go to rural Georgia as rural can be, and we go to metro because, as been stated earlier, sex trafficking is everywhere. It's not in the quote-unquote bad neighborhood. It's in every neighborhood, and we need to provide that training. In fact, at the time in 2011 that we sought to pass House Bill 200, we passed in the House. We were getting a lot of grief on the Senate side. And we ran into a fact pattern in Dodge County, Cochran, Georgia, a town of 5,000 folks, where a family was selling their 14-year-old girl to the 66-year-old used car manager in lieu of the minivan payment. Mom got 8 years, dad got 10, used car lot dealer got 10. I'm pretty comfortable at this time there would be life sentences if that same fact pattern arose. Following the passage of House Bill 200, we started training law enforcement. And between Kamala and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, we initially started with the state troopers because they once again have statewide jurisdiction. Trooper stops a car in rural Georgia right off of the interstate, doesn't smell right, the girl won't look to him, the girl's not talking, the guy's doing all the talking, he's just had the training. He calls the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for backup. Long and short of it is this was a girl from Birmingham, Alabama. Similar to what Ernie said before, most of the kids we see in Georgia are from the Southeast. Girl from Alabama, she was 17, had been trafficked since the age of 12. Georgia was the fourth state she was trafficked in. So the training works. The training leads to the arrest. The training leads to saving victims. Last September, Kamala went to Chatham, you know it as Savannah, and they trained over 500 officers. And within 3 weeks, they had a sting. 7 victims were identified and saved at that time with numerous arrests. As has been referenced earlier, when you do a sting on sex trafficking, you're not twiddling your thumbs waiting to see what happens. The phone immediately rings. These folks are more than willing to buy young kids for sex. Right after this time, we had this thing come into Atlanta called the Final Four basketball tournament. And we know whenever you've got those big sporting events, you're going to have folks coming into town with the trafficking. So we worked with the city of Atlanta, the suburban areas, anyone and everyone, the taxi drivers, hoteliers, etc. And at that time, we came up with the idea we were going to start with another nonprofit, a campaign that's called Georgia's Not Buying It. And if you go to the website, it's notbuyingit.org. This program is now being used in Arizona and Indiana. The new AG for the District of Columbia, Carl Racine, has just signed on to be a part of it, along with several other state AGs. And the whole idea is to introduce the law in your area, to introduce the the training modules, to have billboards, to literally have a full process where we go through the advertising council to educate anyone, everyone we can around this country with the program. So the last several Super Bowls have used our program. You know, there's a mindset, as has been referenced earlier, that there's a relationship between teen dating violence, campus rape, domestic violence, and sex trafficking, because in all of them, you're objectifying the woman and not viewing the woman as a gift from God. So we have to get to the point that we get into a room with men, that we get into a room with our sons, and we say, when you're watching sports on TV and the ad selling food shows more of the lady's body than less, they're not selling the food. The food might not even taste so good. And we need to have that discussion with our sons and with our colleagues, whether it's men's clubs in churches or anywhere else, to say this isn't appropriate. If you buy the kid, you need to serve years in jail. The idea where the cop tells the buyer run or it's $100 fine is no longer acceptable. You now need to serve time in jail. So Kamala does her part, training folks all over the state, working with other prosecutors to bring these cases. It's an everyday incident. Future legislation. So this year our legislation does two things. Number one, it allows law enforcement officers to charge individuals who attempt to buy undercover officers posing as a child. Let's face it, you're calling, they're saying they're 12. We want the offense to be as if that individual is 12. Another thing we're doing that's sort of different is we're including the enhanced penalties for folks with developmental disabilities. We have seen traffickers use adults with developmental disabilities for trafficking. And the person may be 30, but they've got an IQ of an 8-year-old, and you need to have the enhanced penalty for that fact pattern. We're also working to make the second conviction of pandering of an adult a felony. Now, it's already a felony pandering with a child, but if it's an adult, the second offense would now be a felony. One of the other things that we need to be working on throughout this country is you can have laws that say 10 to 20, 20 to 30, whatever you want, but you cannot permit the sentence to be 100% probated. When you're dealing, once again, with the buyers, when you're dealing with a minor, there has to be minimum jail sentence. That's the only way you really get at the demand. You've got to provide the deterrence. It's got to be your neighbor who's spending time in jail that scares all the other neighbors to not do it. The only way you say you solve this problem is to provide that deterrent effect. So I think it's safe to say that among the country with the AGs, we're making great strides. We're working hard in our states. But as you all know, we still have a long way to go to end human trafficking. But when you have days such that the training leads to immediate arrest and you immediately save some of these minors and you treat them as a victim rather than a prostitute, that is a great day that makes it all worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you, General Owens. Next, so glad to have Kubiki Pride, mother of a survivor, with us. Kubiki Pride is an advocate against the exploitation of women and girls who has leveraged her own experience as a mother whose child was victimized by child sex slavery to educate policymakers and service providers on the issue of domestic minor sex trafficking. Although she has found no easy route to free her family from the chains that connect her to this horrendous crime, she has found solace in the fact that today the fight to save children from a similar fate is no longer in the shadows. She works with organizations like Shared Hope International to bring the fight to those who most often walk away with no repercussions, the buyers and facilitators, in an effort to find justice for the survivors. Kubiki, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I want to first thank the Commission and Shared Hope and you, sir. I was just sitting here listening to all of the panelists and especially Ms. Front, and just recognizing that at 9 years old, she didn't know, but at 30 some odd years old, I knew nothing about child trafficking. I was not informed. I have lived in America all my life, and I was completely clueless that children were being sold, not only in my neighborhood, but all around in all of the cities and events that I'm going to. I'm now noticing that you have to cover so many different ends. And so it leads me to believe that I'm not the only one. Only because my child was victimized did I even understand what child trafficking was. I had used Backpage.com on several different occasions for my children to sell games and toys, just different used goods to replace. And to find my child there for sale was probably one of the most mind-breaking experiences that I've ever had. And so I will say to you all that the support, the knowledge, the education, all of those things are so needed. But if someone would have, in all of the parenting classes that I had attended, just told me that these things were going on and right next door, or, you know, I walked into a convenience store and I saw 6 pictures of missing children. I now live in Georgia, but I walked into a convenience store and saw 6 pictures of missing children. I often go into Walmart and I see these pictures of these missing children, and it leads me back to Backpage. It leads me back to where it is that I'm readily hearing that children are being sold for sex. The demand, I will say this, if no one handles the demand, then it will continue going on. It will continue to be a hidden thing. People will be sitting right beside you and you won't know that this is going on. Unless you make tougher penalties for people that are doing this crime, then it will continue, and then there'll be more faces like mine and more parents in this same pain. And I don't want to see that, ever. And I'm finished.
Thank you. Thank you all. This is amazing, hard to listen to, sobering, heartbreaking, but so important. And I do think there's things we can do. And so that's the hope we have to take out of this. We've got about a little over 20 minutes still remaining, so I do want to open it up to questions that the audience might have of any of our panelists. I'm going to start out the questioning if I could, and open it to any of you. But I think this is a hard time in Congress, certainly perception that we don't get along on anything, that we're fighting on everything. I think that's true on many things, but I do believe there's opportunity in this battle to come together, where there is across the spectrum, across the board, from what I've seen, and that, you know, maybe that's an overstatement, but significant amount of Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate, members of Congress, staff, former members who really want to do something and are willing to do hard things to make a difference. So I guess I would just kind of open it up and maybe start with Tiana, if you talked a little bit about the Nordic and plan, some of the things Sweden has done in other countries. It's kind of been echoed through some of the other presenters as well, of the impact that it's had. So I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about what does it take. Alan, you talked some about some small changes that would make huge differences in empowering states. I want to follow up on that some more. But are there any other suggestions that I can take to other members? I do want to give a quick shout out. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney came in. She is passionate about this issue. She's from New York City, Manhattan area. Carolyn and I are good friends, work on the Financial Services Committee together. Carolyn is a Democrat, I'm a Republican. She had a couple other things that she's has to be at today. It's a busy day, so I apologize that other members weren't here, but there is great interest in this, and she just wanted to echo that of her desire to work together to let's do what we can do. So I just throw that out of suggestions, 1 or 2 or 3 things I can take to my colleagues from this to say this is what we need to do, and this is where we as federal government, along with working with state law enforcement, can really make a difference to protect lives. So I guess throw that out. If you'd have 1 or 2 suggestions kind of boiled down from your testimony that I can bring back.
Thank you, Congressman. So, you know, because we're an international organization, we have the great benefit of seeing an amazing grassroots global movement, national movements, really working to change the legal frameworks toward what is known as the Nordic or the equality model, whereby, for those of you who don't know, it's there are three basic legal frameworks that govern prostitution. One is full criminalization, like the United States, where you can't buy, you can't sell sexual acts. And then there's decriminalization or legalization, like we see in the Netherlands, Germany, New Zealand, certain states of Australia, where it's total decriminalization of the sex trade. So brothel owners are businessmen, and pimps are managers, and traffickers are migrant facilitators. And then there's this third way that started in Sweden in 1999, where they recognized that prostitution was inherently violent, inherently dehumanizing, and was really targeted toward vulnerable populations, and especially women and girls. And so recognizing that they provide services, through the law you provide services to prostituted individuals, and exit strategies if they're ready to leave the sex trade, but you penalize the demand. And so, but more importantly, I think, and I think that's where your bill is critical, is that more than laws, it has changed the mindset of how we view prostitution and even issues of equality. So for instance, before the 1999 law, 72% of Swedish men believed that it was okay to purchase a woman for sex. Now, 16 years later, 76% would rather get arrested for driving under the influence than purchasing a woman, and they believe that prostitution is a barrier to gender equality. So you see this mind shift that we are so far removed from that right now, and we have tremendous forces. Mr. Allen was talking about following the money, and in this country, I think in our states, as we all know, our opponents are extremely well financed. The sex trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and so I would suggest that, you know, at a state-by-state basis, it's critically important to continue these conversations at the school level with the medical community. I cannot stress this enough. We, instead of getting into ideological battles, which we've been doing for the last 3 decades, it's really important to engage the medical community because we don't have the data on the harms of prostitution. We really need to recognize this as a public health crisis, not in an HIV/AIDS type of narrow harm reduction way, but really looking at what unwanted serial sexual invasion does to the mind, body, and soul of a human being. And we need that data. And I think once we have that data as a community, we will recognize that this is a serious human rights violation that needs to end.
I would like to echo what Taina said. Everything she said is right on point. I would want to add to it, legalization has shown us in Germany and the Netherlands that it is nothing more than an increase in the horrific crime of human trafficking. It increases with the job titles that she gave them. All it does is, increase your organized crime activity, increase the violence against women and girls when you make it legal to gang rape a 5 or 6 month pregnant woman as a normal commerce. That is as much a human rights violation as I can even imagine. My specific recommendation or hope that would be continued was already brought up earlier when it comes down to the Communications Decency Act. We saw with the National John Suppression Initiative over the 4.5 years of the first 9 sting operations, an increase of online activity from 61 to 83%. The arrests were online activity for that particular, the stings that we were running. And that's quite an increase over a short period of time, really, because my personal experience was street prostitution 12 years ago. And I was hard-pressed years and years back to be able to, if we were doing interventions with women inside the jail walls at Cook County Department of Corrections, to find a woman that had an online experience in terms of her prostitution history. And in the last 5 years, the last 6 years, it has increased markedly. Now, almost all of them have had some type of experience and have been posted on some website. So I think that the CDA is a very, very important. Those few words that would change that would save lives.
Just a quick comment on that, Congressman. Obviously, I agree. I think it's important to provide context, and that amending the CDA is going to be very difficult. There was an effort a few years ago addressing the whole issue of Hollywood versus Silicon Valley and copyright protection. There was an agreement, legislation called SOPA and PIPA, which blew up at the last minute. So what we found after the 47 state AGs signed that letter and sent it to Congress is there was really not an appetite on either side of the aisle to address it. My hope is that that will change, because I believe that there is a very important component of the CDA, and that is to protect the companies that are backbones of the internet from inadvertent liability based on what people post on their sites. It's a legitimate purpose. However, I don't believe that the intention of Congress in 1996 was to apply it to every conceivable internet site. Yeah. And when a site is, and sites, General Olin's businessman friend in Atlanta said you shouldn't be able to adopt a shelter kitten, sell a used car, purchase a toaster, and buy a child for sex on the same site. There's something wrong with this picture. And so my view is, I mean, there's clearly going to be pushback from the internet industry and their vision of protecting their business model. But my argument is there have to be limits. And so I think it's timely for Congress to reconsider limited surgical changes that address the fact that there are sites being used to provide the information infrastructure for criminal activity in this country.
I just got a couple I'd like to add. So we're talking a lot about selling online and a lot of online things. Let's not forget the boys. And so with that being said, so a lot of our boys are actually flown out to Miami, to LA. Most of the men are defined as straight, who are married with children, who are judges and lawyers and have really great jobs because they fly them out, and they're minors. So where do they find them? So there are actually sites that we'll talk offline about that men who buy sex, they have blogs and they rate the women and girls and boys and actually say the exchange and then have links online to their websites. There's a site that was supposed to be shut down. It was shut down mostly for the girls. The things is for the boys, because no one's looking for the boys, it's kiddie porn. It is literally penises. They say their name. They say 12. They say 13 because there's not enough people going on that side of the TS, transgender, and boys looking for the boys who are minors. So it's very actually way in your face. It's hidden more with girls. Like not hidden, there are codes. There's no codes with boys.
Right.
There's not a code because no one's even going on that end. So the services as well for the boys have to be equal as well. Mm-hmm. My mission is children, no matter what gender, who are trafficked. So people always ask me, do we have more boys? Do we have more girls? Listen, when I grew up in Chicago, the reason why I work with boys is that boys are being trafficked right around me in foster care, the same age. It's always been that way, though. This is not new. The laws and criminals, we would really hope, right, that crime didn't happen in one place and not the other. It would be wonderful if no one stole cars in the United States. That'd be awesome. The problem is crime is the same everywhere, everyone. So one thing that happens in another country happens the same exact thing here. There's no difference. That's how crime works. The harder part is that it's a criminal enterprise, but we don't actually see trafficking sometimes as that. And then we take out the men who buy sex and we don't include them into enterprise, but they fuel it. So we got to include them because they fuel it. So do they knowingly know? Well, for the boys, it's pretty easy. And they are also on chat lines for the boys. And you knowingly say your age really quick so they can get their phone number. You see what I'm saying? So do they know? Do they know they're minors then? Online is done the same way with girls that is done with boys on these, and they are geared toward youth, right? All the online sites that are geared toward youth. When kids tell me that they were on Tagged, I say immediately, that's just men who buy sex. And they say, yeah, I know. But see, they know that. So when we saying we need to educate our youth, use the right language then. You said trafficking. You didn't say prostitution or getting some money when I need it. That's not what you said. So no, kids talk about this issue all day. They know knowingly about this. We're not using the right words to explain it to them. We're coming in as this is something new and not coming in as what is your experience right now that you're seeing actively.
Thanks. I do want to, we just have 10 minutes, but I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. Yes. That's great. Let me repeat the question. We're going to be live streaming this, so encourage anybody. It's also going to be on the Tom Lantos website, so please let people know who are able to make it that the video from this will be available. The question was, we've been talking a lot about law changes, which certainly are important, but also as significant, maybe more significant, is cultural impacts, moral, cultural push, I guess, that is encouraging this type of activity or saying that this is okay. What are some of the things that we can do to address cultural problems that are helping to drive this demand?
The Cities Empowered Against Sexual Exploitation, a project of demand abolition under Hunt Alternative Funds. Ambassador Swanee Hunt's organization out of Cambridge has many different tactics that are being undertaken in 11 cities in the United States, and we happen to be one of them. And it is really refreshing to see that many of the tactics include male allies. Having male allies is critical because, I mean, these statistics tell us that 15% of the male population in the United States has at least one time purchased sex. This is what it says, between 13 and 15%. Okay, well, you know, numbers are numbers, but that gives us a benchmark. But that means there's 85% of the male population, and we'll assume that 85 or 100% are in this room that have not bought sex. So those are our allies. Those men are our defenders, as they're called with Shared Hope. Those men are the men who can help a man who might have bought sex to understand the harm from the male perspective. It's critical to hear from men. I mean, we as the survivors will tell you that you hurt us, you harmed us, we didn't like it. You know, all of that is critical as well. But you must have men who are willing to also carry the torch and carry, you know, have it be a mantra that buying sex is a human rights violation against any human being, women, girls, boys, men, transgender. Male allies are awesome. We have a program that we're starting that's using university level men. It's called 30 Under 30, and it's just getting underway, where young men are doing focus groups right now so that we can kind of understand their attitudes before and after, you know, certain amount of discussion and education and, about the subject matter of buying sex. And we're hoping that it will take off and do some very exciting things in the universities in the Chicago and Cook County area. But there are many other male ally-driven important pieces going on. Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation was the first in the country to have a curriculum geared at boys, educating young boys in middle school and high school, and they're now working on a curriculum for college level but as well as they have one for young girls, because it's important for us to teach our young women, our young girls, to respect themselves and be empowered and understand that they're worthwhile and cannot be bought and should not be bought.
Thanks. Vicky?
I did want to say that I think that as far as society goes, the impression that a lot of our youth, the impression that they're getting is that it's okay to victimize women. They see it as a okay thing to do, to be mildly sexually harass girls in school. And then you tap adults on the wrist when they commit very similar crimes. So I think that in our country right now, our morals are so low because we are allowing so many things that were not okay in the past. And it's being publicized on TV, on the radio, the strip clubs, everything is so visible. So basically we're teaching our children from a very young age that sex is it sells, you get it, you take it, and that it's okay. With that being said, the education needs to start so much younger. You teach children so young, did someone touch you? But you're not teaching them, well, don't touch anyone else.
So the room is like 80% women, right? So whenever I do talks, whenever Kamala does talks, probably it's higher usually. This is probably a greater percentage of men than usual. So, and the longer I'm in government, whether it's law enforcement or other public service, the less I have confidence in government solving any problems. The more I think it has to be from the nonprofit / faith-based community. So I think we need to get men to go out in their local community, whether it's their church, whether it's Kiwanis, whether it's Rotary, whatever you want to call it, you call it, and they have to have programs that are specific to only men and boys to have that discussion. It's got to be an educational process. It can't be done by women. Women are not going to teach a 16-year-old boy proper behavior, right? And women aren't going to walk into a room full of men at a church and teach them behavior. We've got to show leadership. It's got to be men that solve this problem if it's going to be solved, short of a jail cell.
Can I make just a real quick question? I wanted to play off what Kaliki said. Lisa, your question about the cultural things. I think it's really important to engage media, marketing, advertising. We are sexualizing kids at younger and younger ages. There are lots of examples from the pimp costume, Halloween costumes for 4 and 5-year-olds. And until we engage, I mean, media has power. Advertising has power, which is why companies spend billions to influence the attitudes and decisions that consumers make. And I think we need to engage Madison Avenue and advertising leaders in thinking about the implications of the way they're spending those dollars, because it's having massive impact on the culture and on the attitudes, particularly toward the sexualization of younger and younger kids.
I wanted to quickly, I actually really like that question. I was actually thinking about that. So when you say culture, to me, my definition of that is Latina, African American, Thailand. Do you know why? Because each person in our environment that we grew up in learned something a different way than everyone else. So I grew up in the inner city, mostly foster care in Cabrini Greens or the Ida B. Wells home, South Side and West Side, lower income Chicago. That's important because everybody in my environment growing up was a big thing when you were 16 and 17 for someone to purchase someone for you for your birthday. It was a huge thing at 18 to go to a strip club. That's what they did in the area. It was a huge thing that I grew up and grandmothers told me, closed legs don't get fed. You see what I'm saying? So cultures are different. The way people learn are different. So if we're doing this right, then we need to have it on the right culture, because your culture may not be, and I may not listen to you because you do not understand my culture. If I'm in the parenting class And the person presenting to me, everybody in the room is African American, but the person that's presenting, I may not even pay attention to what you're saying because you don't understand me. See, we're culture competent about that, but not about the other issues that's important, the way we receive services, the way we receive information. So just when we say culture competency, just expand our knowledge of what that means.
Wow, I hate to say this. We have a hard stop at noon, so I'm so sorry. What I do want to offer out is questions that you would have. If you can get those to us, to me, this is just the start. This isn't the finish. This is the beginning of a conversation that is too important not to have. And I'm just confident with this group of people and this group of people that we could save somebody. And you think about it, if one life, one little girl, one little boy could be saved from this abuse, torture, being used up and thrown away, it's all worth it. And we just have to keep reminding ourselves of that. The other thing we have to remind ourselves is this is going to be hard. This isn't as strong as it is because of some fluke. It is incredibly powerful because there's lots of money involved. There's deep cultural problems. There's degradation that has happened over decades that we've looked the other way. It's going to be hard to say enough. This has to stop. I do want to thank you for being here. Thank you so much to our panelists. I want to give a special shout out again to Exodus Cry. Lila Mickelwaite, a good friend in back, was really the one that helped introduce this really devastatingly important issue to me. Thank you, and thank you to all who are doing things. Another thing we're going to have to talk about, with my legislation, just makes sense to me that the prostitution and governments who kind of wink and nod at prostitution ought to be held accountable. But we're getting pushback. We get pushback from our own State Department that says, you know what, this doesn't really help us in our trade negotiations to have this come up, so we don't want to talk about it. You know what, that's unacceptable. But we're going to see it in other things. I know Exodus Cry and some other groups are doing work of looking at other prostitution. Clearly is a driver of demand. If you've got prostitution happening, then you have underage prostitution. If you have underage prostitution and prostitution, you have human trafficking. And you have to recognize that. But you also have to recognize that one day someone doesn't wake up and say, I'm going to go purchase a child for prostitution. So much of it is tied to pornography. And it's a multi-billion dollar industry, there's dominoes here. And we've talked about it with advertising and other things leading to one thing, leading to another. There's a strategy that is out there, and we are going to have to be honest about that and start digging in deeply. If we're going to hope to root this out, the roots go deep. It's going to be hard. But again, you have to ask ourselves, is that life of that little girl, that little boy worth it? It's worth it. So thank you all so much for being here. This is the start, not the end. We will continue to work together and hopefully one day be able to celebrate that we've had a significant impact on saving lives. Thank you.